Former CIA Director John Brennan has become a political foil for President Trump, and now he's opening up to the New York Times Magazine about his public feud with the commander-in-chief and to defend his legacy as former President Barack Obama's counterterrorism expert. The author of the article, Mattathias Schwartz, joins me now from Washington. Matt, thanks for being with us. How did this feud begin, and what are Brennan's major issues with President Trump?
The feud began, I think it sort of started in a big way when President Trump, or Mr. Trump, as John Brennan prefers to call him, gave his big speech immediately after the inauguration in front of the CIA memorial wall. And, was bragging about the size of his crowds. That wall, it memorializes fallen CIA officers who've died in the line of duty. It's considered sacred by people in the intelligence community. So that was pretty offensive to John Brennan and to James Clapper, the former DNI. And forgive me, you had another question.
Oh, just, what are his... I guess you answered it. What were his major issues?
His issue with the president is character. That Donald Trump is, irresponsible and pretty wild-minded, and isn't the kind of person who's fit to hold the office. And despite what the Electoral College might say, that he's just not conducting himself in a way that's suitable for the commander-in-chief. I mean, I think there's a lot of evidence pointing to that direction. I think an important thing to note, though, is that we kind of have a system now where a lot of the presidents that the authorities that the president holds,
right,
particularly when it comes to drone strikes and counterterrorism, we know so little about how these things are being used that if the president is not someone of good character, there's really not a lot of recourse by Congress, the courts, or the people, because there are so many authorities concentrated in the executive right now, and that trend is much larger than John Brennan or Barack Obama. It really goes back to 9/11 and even before that.
Sure, and as you mentioned in your piece, Brennan's current willingness to speak publicly against the president does break with the pattern set by other former CIA directors. Why do you think it's so important to him that he break that pattern, that he be the one to speak up?
Well, he talks a lot about this in the piece. But I think, if you look at President Trump's conduct, it too has broken a lot of norms for how, presidents have conducted themselves in the past in terms
Sure.
of, just what he says on Twitter, his willingness to intervene, his willingness to campaign, these, pretty wild rallies that he holds as though, the election were still like an unfolding event. His comments after Charlottesville, which to me struck me as pretty overtly racist.
Right.
So
let me ask you.
So you've kind of got the Michelle Obama, when they, go low, we stay high, but Brennan's really willing to get in the ring and trade some blows with President Trump.
Right. So along that point, let me ask you: the CIA is, of course, supposed to be a neutral entity, but as you mentioned, President Trump has rallied against the intelligence community for being bipartisan. He's also broken some other norms. So is all of this, both from Brennan and from the president, is all of this undermining the intelligence community's ability to be independent?
You could certainly make that argument. I've heard people say this makes it harder for people who are still inside the intelligence community. But I mean, we're living in a pretty unprecedented time, and no one really knows what the rules are. And with all the talk over the Russia investigation and and Congress and elections, one thing that's getting lost is all of these authorities regarding targeted killing that Trump inherited from Obama, and which we really know very little about how he's using. I mean, the CIA has, a drone program, but the executive isn't allowed to talk about that. Everyone knows this is true, but it's classified. So the president can tell the CIA to kill we don't know who in a variety of countries, almost anywhere in the world. And I think we're not going to find out exactly how those authorities are being used now until many years down the road.
And Brennan is not specifically addressing the drone program, is he?
He hasn't a whole lot, but he does begin to in this article, which is in the New York Times Magazine this Sunday. He does start to reflect both on how those authorities developed under Obama and also, what constraints ought to be in place. Both he and Obama did not want the CIA to have a drone program. They were both on the record before, and then Brennan also in this piece talking about drones being exclusively a military thing, which seems normal if we are indeed in some sort of perpetual war. But for whatever reason, that didn't happen. And there's a lot less oversight when those programs are under CIA control.
Matt, I'm glad that you brought up former President Obama, because I also want to ask you about Brennan's relationship with him. Could you explain their closeness?
Well, I think I write in the piece that a lot of people who were close to President Obama, told me that early in President Obama's term, he really needed someone who had ties to the intelligence community, who knew how it worked, who could sort of get the relationship off on the right foot. John Brennan served that role. There was also a lot of friction between Obama and the Pentagon early on regarding the strategy in Afghanistan. And I think that's one reason you saw so much counterterrorism authority shift to the CIA, because, there's a lot of evidence, if you read Bob Gates' memoir, for example, that Barack Obama simply was not comfortable early on, putting his most sensitive programs and his efforts through the military. He felt like they were seeking to get him, too deeper into Afghanistan than he wanted to be.
Right. All right. So, Matt, during his tenure, Brennan worked closely with current Chief of Staff John Kelly. What was their relationship like? And do you know if they are still in contact?
I don't know if they're still in contact. John Brennan did talk to me a little bit about what it was like talking to Chief of Staff Kelly during Barack Obama's first term. During that time, John Kelly was a chief military aide for Leon Panetta and Bob Gates, the Barack Obama's first two secretaries of defense. So when there was, a drone strike that needed approval, it was the two of them, John Brennan and John Kelly, on the phone. They both at times have talked about, their North Star is a phrase that they both use. But as to whether what their relationship was like during, the second term when Kelly went to Southcom, or whether they're still in touch now, I wouldn't be able to say. It is interesting, though, that they did, have this kind of collegiality for a time.
Thank you for pulling back the curtain there a bit and giving us a peek at the goings-on. Mattathias Schwartz from Washington, thank you.
Thank you for having me.